Today, I want to talk about a double standard that very, very few want to touch, and hopefully the social media gods won't get too upset that I am talking about it and take this video down, because I just know it's going to piss the ladies off. This one might get me in a wee bit of trouble. So you'll have to bear with me on how I word certain things so that I don't get in trouble and have this video nuked. All right, so let's dive into it. We're constantly told that men watching porn is toxic, that it's destructive and ruins relationships. And sometimes I think that criticism is fair. I mean, if you're choosing to view once in a while, I don't really think it's any big deal. But if you're doing it every day, well, I mean, if that's the case, I do think it's fair to say you might have a bit of a problem. But here's the part that everyone skips. While they love to talk about men and their habits, they completely ignore those of women. And I hate to break it to y'all, but women are every bit as guilty of partaking in that, let's call it behavior, as men are. With most of the sites putting the number of women who are, let's say connoisseurs at anywhere between 30 and 40% of their total viewership. But see, that doesn't even tell the whole story, because there's another form of porn that women use in far, far greater numbers than men. And most people don't even consider it to be porn, and yet it is. What am I referring to? Romance novels, some of which would make even the most hardcore sailor blush. Oh, they may not be exactly the same thing. I mean, one is visual and one is written. But what's written on those pages is every bit as unrealistic and, let's say, overt as what's on the screen. And it speaks to the mindset and double standard that exists, because women binge reading romance novels isn't healthier. It's the same poison, just in a different flavor. And pretending otherwise is doing real damage to relationships and marriage. So let's dive in and explore that just a bit. Many psychologists and so-called experts say that porn trains men to expect women to behave like the performers. Well, I'd argue that romance novels do the exact same thing in reverse. They train women to expect men to behave like fictional emotional support billionaires, ones with chiseled abs, Olympic stamina, and zero needs of their own. Yeah, different types of media, sure, but in the end, the same outcome. Unrealistic expectations, disappointment, and ultimately resentment, and a slow erosion of intimacy. Probably the number one thing I've heard from those in the know is that fantasy ends up replacing reality. They say that porn convinces some men that intimacy should look scripted, extreme, and effortless, and I'm not going to really argue that point. But I will argue that shouldn't the same be said about what's going on in those romance novels? Because they also convince some women that love should feel like a constant emotional roller coaster curated by a novelist. He's always supposed to know exactly what she wants. He should be able to read her mind. He should always say the perfect thing. He should always chase, always initiate, always desire her, but never want anything messy in return. He should always be able to fulfill her every wish and dream without ever worrying about his. In the end, it's not really any different. Either way, it's fiction, it's fantasy, and real people in the real world don't live in fantasy land, or at least they shouldn't. And when fantasy becomes the standard, reality always loses. Critics of porn always make the argument that it causes men to compare their wives to the stars, and in some cases I do think that's true. But if we're going to say that, are we seriously going to say that women don't do the exact same thing while reading those novels or watching those shows? I mean, come on. Women compare their husbands to fictional men who don't exist all the time. Hell, they've even created a mantra for it. You know how men are only good enough if they're 6 feet tall with six-pack abs, a 6-inch you-know-what, And of course, at least 6 figures coming in. And when you have that mindset, and most of today's women do, then suddenly the man who works, provides, fixes things, and shows up every day feels boring, predictable. He's just not exciting enough. And it's largely because he's competing with a character written by a woman whose job is to sell dopamine, not build a marriage or relationship. Another issue that critics commonly bring up is how it creates expectations without effort in women. They say that porn can train men to expect performance without the emotional connection. Okay, fair enough. Again, I'm not going to argue. It is in theory possible, though, let's be honest, I don't actually think that's the case with most guys. Anyway, again, if you're going to make that argument, then you also have to admit that those so-called romance novels, rom-coms, and all the other TV shows out there train women to expect emotional perfection from men without any contribution or reciprocation whatsoever from the women. Oh, she wants to be desired like the heroine, pursued like that heroine, validated like the heroine. But she doesn't realize the heroine never has to deal with bills, stress, kids, fatigue, or compromise. Those romance novels and rom-coms don't show the boring parts, and neither does porn. It presents an ideal which, if we're being honest, is kind of the point behind them. When fantasy is your baseline, contentment feels like settling, and dissatisfaction becomes the default. Men report all the time about their wives becoming chronically dissatisfied, always wanting more. More passion, more excitement, more reassurance, more attention, more stuff. But they're also unable to articulate what that actually looks like in the real world. Oh, they say they want it, but can't define themselves what it is. And that's because the fantasy never defined it either. Just promised a feeling. And we all know about women and their feelings, don't we? And in the end, the net result of too much porn or romance novels is that it makes intimacy transactional. Porn reduces sex to performance. Romance reduces love to constant emotional labor. He feels like an ATM with a pulse. She feels like intimacy should be automatic. And both parties end up feeling unseen. The fact is, real intimacy requires effort from both sides. It takes work. It takes acknowledgement. What it doesn't take is scripts, nor tropes, nor viral narratives. Look, this isn't about defending porn. I'll be the first to admit, like anything else, too much of it has real downsides. It can be addicting. But so do all those romance novels, shows, and the like. The problem isn't desire. The problem is letting entertainment rewire our expectations. Just like men can be trained by porn, women can be and are trained by romance fiction. And pretending only one of those is harmful is dishonest, disingenuous at best. Healthy relationships are built on reality, not fantasy, not double standards, and not by pretending one gender is immune to influence. In the end, if we actually cared about relationships, cared about marriages, then we stop pretending this is a men-only issue. We need to stop moralizing one behavior while romanticizing the other. And we need to start holding everyone to the same standards. Reality over fantasy, effort over entitlement, truth over comfort. And until we do, the end result will be even more unhappy marriages, even more unhappy relationships in general. Okay, hopefully this video won't get banned for touching on something the social media gods certainly don't want us talking about. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this whole subject. And perhaps most of all, have you ever considered that there really isn't a difference between porn and those romance novels? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to hit that like, because it helps grow the channel, which in turn helps me to raise awareness on the issues men and boys face, as well as to bring out some of the double standards as well. On that note, this is Dan. I hope you have a great day.